start with friction. Hopefully that will make sense why we start there. But obviously, if you think about a tire, you've got or a car rather, you've got 4 contact patches. Those things are about the size of a softball. That's your entire connection to the ground. So all the forces the car is feeling, everything that's going on, all the changes of direction, that has to all be channeled through those 4 contact patches. So I want to start with why friction matters, talk a little bit about mechanical versus aerodynamic friction and why it matters there. Then I'll sort of explain lift and how lift is generated at a high level, how wings work, and then kind of some basic principles to think about, how to think about aerodynamics and lift generation, that kind of stuff. And then from there, I'll talk about aerodynamics, and then particularly like the ACC screen kind of set up, like what they're actually referring to when they talk about that reference point, and then car setup as well. So why don't we go ahead and get started talking about friction. So there will be some math here. It's pretty straightforward. Hopefully none of it's going to be too controversial. But again, if you have questions or things don't make sense, let me know. So let's start with the basic friction equation. And you can see that here, and that's F is equal to negative Kn. Pretty straightforward, right? But if you think about kind of an XY axis, right? Like if you guys think back to your like high school days or whatever, high school physics days, in that XY axis, the friction force here is the horizontal friction force. K is what's known as the friction coefficient, and then N is the normal force. So the key thing to take away here is if you think about a car, right? When you look at a car, the friction force in any direction, whether that, let's just say that my tire, I'm trying to put down power, right, and I'm accelerating, the friction force that's being applied is in this, the force that is being applied in this direction, kind of the reaction force is in the opposite direction. Let's just call that the x-axis, okay? Now, the amount of friction force that the car can tolerate before it starts slipping is really determined by how much weight or normal force is applied in the y direction or in the normal direction, right? So you can begin to understand why aerodynamics matter, is that, really the weight of the car and the amount of force that's pressing down on that contact patch, that is actually the thing that determines how much grip you have, rather than any other kind of weight or forces in any other direction. So it's really important to understand that the friction that's sort of in the horizontal plane or the plane of the tires is influenced by the amount of force that's applied in the plane that's perpendicular to that. Okay. And then so what is K? It's the friction coefficient, right? And that's really determined. Simple way to explain it is it's the relative surface roughness of those objects, or the stickiness of those objects. If you get down to it at kind of an atomic level, it's really the interaction of forces between the 2 molecules, right? So there's a reason why tires are made of rubber, is because those tend to have a lot of this surface roughness or attraction between, road surfaces, things like that. So a simple way to demonstrate this is if you can just kind of put your hands together and lightly slide your hands across each other, right? Now, put some force between, kind of press your hands together and then try to slide your hands and see the difference in how difficult it is to slide your hands back and forth, right? That's directly this equation coming into play and what that means. So hopefully that makes sense. I'll stop there. Anybody have any questions on that? Is that unclear to anybody? Okay, sounds like that's clear. Okay, so let's think about a couple questions here, right? So given just what we know about this equation, I'll ask questions here, so just jump in if you know the answer. Think about tire temps and the tire contact patch. Where do these come into play in this particular equation?
They determine the friction coefficient, I imagine.
Yeah, sorry, who's that speaking? I couldn't exactly hear. Let me turn you up.
Oh, that was Ben Roberts.
Yeah, so that's exactly it, right? It's the friction coefficient, right? So when you have cold tires, right, that rubber is harder. It's not as pliable, and so its ability to kind of fill in the gaps of the road surface and kind of create that relative surface roughness is not optimal, right? So as those tire temperatures heat up, as they become more malleable, they can fill in the gaps in that road surface, and they're increasing that friction coefficient, right? How about the tire contact patch itself?
It augments, like it's larger.
Yeah. So that's one way to think about it. Yeah, it augments, it's larger. But what does that mean? This is a little bit of a trick question. It's not in this
It's
this
also
equation.
friction coefficient, I imagine.
No, it's not friction coefficient. That's why I asked it that way, because I want you guys to think about this. This is sort of a two-dimensional equation, right? Now think about it in a three-dimensional, right? So I'll sort of, like I said, I'm being a little bit kind of tricky here, but the way to think about it is force has in three dimensions, it also has an impact over an area, right? So if you think about that friction force, right, that coefficient, that normal, the coefficient is really determined by the objects themselves, or the fundamental material properties, basically. So you can go in, engineering textbook or any engineering, or even like Wikipedia, and look up the relative friction coefficient between two types of objects, and you'll have just a catalog of different K values, right? Now that force, right, if you think back to, can anybody tell me what the fundamental equation is for force? Like F equals ma. Have you guys heard that?
Mass and acceleration.
Yeah, exactly. So force is equal to mass times acceleration, right? Now you can also say that force is equal to that applied over an area, right, is your total force. So you can take kind of the forces at each individual little point at which the tire is connecting, right? Multiply that by the area, and that's the total force that you're getting, right? So the reason I kind of asked that question is I want you to basically take that thinking, right, and say, okay, look, I know this total force capability based on two factors, the friction coefficient and the normal force. Now the amount of area that I'm applying that matters more, right? So that's why wider tires obviously have more grip, so on and so forth. And also, again, think while you're driving, right? If you put half your tire onto the curb or half your tire on the grass, right, that is changing the friction coefficient across that half of the tire. So therefore, you're losing that entire amount of grip, right? So that's why I kind of asked that question on the contact patch, because I want you guys to think about not just this two-dimensional, but also kind of the three-dimensional implications of this. Okay, and then how about aerodynamics? Where does aerodynamics show up in this equation?
Imagine they determine normal force.
Exactly right. Yeah. So the weight of the car has the impact on normal force, and then aerodynamics has a much more dramatic effect. And so let's think about kind of this mechanical versus aerodynamic grip, and this is something. So I'll caveat this with, I think that if you're D3 or below, you should not really spend a lot of time like working on your car setup, because it's not going to find you as much time as working on your driving lens, all that. And I say that as a slow, D3 silver driver. I also kind of want to emphasize that, because I see like a lot of like D5, D6 drivers being like, well, which setup should I use? Like, to be honest, if you understand the setups of the car and this mechanical aerodynamic grip, really the only thing that I would spend time on if I were you as a D5, D6, probably even a D4 driver, is just getting the aerodynamic balance right, and then spend the rest of the time focusing on my car, and I would just focus on starting with the safer or aggressive setups in ACC, right? And that's an aside, we'll come back to that, but let's think about kind of slow versus high-speed corners. When does mechanical grip matter more? What types of corners?
Slow speed.
Yep, and then how about high speed? Aerodynamic, right? Now again, the reason is because at higher speeds, obviously this normal force, you can think about the two components, right? The weight of the car, the force of gravity over that weight of the car, versus the amount of aerodynamic force. The aerodynamic force is much, much larger in terms of the impact, so it sort of overwhelms really any effect from the car weight itself. But you feel that in different cars, like where the Bentley is pretty heavy, right? Versus cars that may be lighter, like the Jannetta GT4, it feels much lighter on its feet. It's just because the weight of the car is much less. Also, it has a lot less aerodynamics, right? So GT4 cars, because they're lighter, because they have low aerodynamics, mechanical grip matters a lot more, even though they do have some aerodynamics. GT3 cars are all about aerodynamics and how you drive. Okay, so let's think about sliding, right? So there's kind of two different regimes for this friction equation, right? The first is what's known as static friction, and the second is known as kinetic or sliding friction. So what's interesting, and you can see that in this chart right here, right? Static friction, this is basically if I apply a force in the x-axis, right? Basically what I'm getting to is I'm increasing the force that I'm applying in the x direction, this is if I increase the force that's in the normal direction and I sort of increase the amount of force that's in the x direction, right? I can go up to a peak load where I basically overwhelm the amount, what this potential is in this equation, right? So I'm applying a force that's larger than this k times n. Then what happens is you start to slide, right? And then you can see here that the actual kinetic friction coefficient is much, much lower than the static coefficient of friction. And so that's exactly what happens when you slide the car, right? The reason that a tire works is basically because at every point or a wheel works because basically at every point as that wheel rolls through, you're actually getting the benefit of the static friction coefficient, right? But if I were to just, slide this car, when this car starts sliding, I'm no longer getting the benefit of that static coefficient of friction. Now I'm dealing with a dynamic coefficient of friction, which, as you can see in this graph, is always much, much lower, right? And you guys can go and test this yourself, right? Just put a heavy box on the floor. If you guys go to the gym and you do those, like kind of think of football players, right? Like where they basically are pushing kind of the coach that's on I don't know what you would call that, like on the sled, right? It takes a lot more force for them to actually start that sled moving. And then once it moves, it's actually easier for them because of the differences in friction. And again, you can go try this for yourself, right? Take a heavy object, put it on the floor, try to push it. You'll realize that it's harder to push until you actually get that thing sliding, and then it becomes easier. Okay, so given that, what's kind of the purpose of anti-lock brake systems?
Keep the tires closest to the maximum static friction.
Yeah, that's a way to think about it. Yeah.
It's because you don't want the tires to stop completely, because then it's going to be harder for the car to move.
Not necessarily, right? It has to do with this graph, right? The car stopping completely, I would say that's not really what it is, right? So basically what happens is that the anti-lock brake system, right, it's actually trying to get to it's basically sensing when you're, kind of going one side to the other, right? So what this balance is on one side or the other. So it's basically trying to keep that wheel from locking as you're braking, right, to make sure that you're staying on the left side of this particular balance versus going to the right side. And I don't know who that was speaking. So what you were, who gave the initial answer. So that's basically correct. But I kind of wanted to add an addendum here of it's really I'm on this balance. So as I'm driving, right, there's only so much force that tire can provide. If I start to turn the wheel at the same time that I'm braking and I'm on full lock, you guys all know that the car will start to slide, right? That's why everybody says you got to sort of trail brake. You got to start to come off of the pedal because now you're attributing more of the actual total force capability of the tire, the grip of the tire, to turning forces rather than braking forces, right? And anti-lock brake systems, as you're going in a single direction, kind of manage this, right? More advanced ACC, and I think it's actually maybe I don't know if it was who put it in the there's kind of an interesting video that they put in there about Eris talking about the ACC control systems, and one of the things that was kind of in that post that somebody had put in kind of the team chat was that modern ABS on actual cars actually help rotate the car. And so basically what's happening in there is that the way that they actually program these things in race cars is to kind of control which wheels are sliding, which wheels are actually having grip, so on and so forth, to actually help rotate the car as well, right? So in your road car, it's really just to make sure that you don't go past this regime and tip over and start sliding and completely lose control, right? In race cars, it's a little bit different, right? It's really about, just making sure that you're always at this peak grip and it works kind of in concert with when you're turning and all those kinds of things. But you have to work with the tires to make that work. Okay. Any questions there? I'll just kind of look at the list here. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Please.
I just got a real quick question. Would
Sure.
you say that static friction and traction in this scenario are almost synonymous?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, so the amount of traction that you're getting out, right? If you're getting good traction, so like let's think about the Porsche, right? So the Porsche has a ton of traction to get on the corners, right? The reason is because the engine is over the back of the back wheels, right? All the load transfer, and we'll talk about load transfer, like all of that goes onto the back wheels. There's a big wing pushing down, right? That has static friction, right? When you start to break traction and your traction control system kicks in, then you're moving into this kinetic friction regime, right? And that's, again, why traction control is important, right? Because it basically puts you back over the right side so you don't spin your wheels out, right? Does that answer your question, Nate?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before I move on? This is kind of a foundational concept, so I want to make sure everybody understands before we go to the next topic. Okay, looks like everybody's good. Okay, makes sense. So actually, let's do this at the end. I was going to jump in ACC here, but let's talk about lift. So can anybody tell me, why does a wing generate lift? And Ken, you're excluded from answering this question.
Okay, Rodricks, do you mind if I take over to talk about a lift a little bit?
Well, why don't you do that at the end, right? Because I have an agenda that I want to go through here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, because okay, you can go ahead.
Yep. So we can have a follow-on session with Ken of lift.
I'd say
So
it's creating an element of lower pressure versus higher pressure around the wing, which generates downforce.
Yeah, that's one way. Yeah, that's a good answer, Nate. I'll talk a little bit more about what that principle is. Do you know what that principle is called, like lower pressure versus higher pressure?
The Bernoulli principle?
It's the Bernoulli principle.
Bernoulli.
Yeah.
There it is.
Exactly, yeah. So is that kind of everybody's understanding, or does anybody else have any other understandings of how lift is generated?
Let me ask a clarifying question.
Sure, go
This
ahead.
lift, the pressure zones, is that because of the air travel over a larger surface area generating the lower pressure?
So that's another common response, right? So I'll talk about that. I kind of wanted to get some of these common theories out there, right? So that's a good one, Ben. Yes, that's a common explanation. I'll talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else have any other theories that they've heard about, like how wings generate lift or how lift is generated? No other theories. Okay, sounds good. So let's talk about the two that we've heard, right? So again, Bernoulli principle is basically that if you increase the speed of a fluid, so a fluid can be anything, right? So air is a fluid, water is a fluid, basically any gas is a fluid, any liquid is a fluid, right? So that's just kind of a general term. That occurs simultaneously with a decrease in pressure, right? So if I increase or accelerate a fluid, then I also am decreasing the pressure, right? And another element of the Bernoulli principle is that fluids tend to want to be in equilibrium, right? Or another thing that Bernoulli principle sort of relies on is that fluids want to be in equilibrium. So if I'm a fluid that I'm in a high pressure state, I want to move to an area where I'm in a low pressure state. So basically the fluid sort of sees, you can kind of think about it. It's like, hey, I'm over here, right? And let's just say that, I'm over on the left-hand side of the screen here, right? And you guys are all in a high pressure state, right? And then if this, everybody on the screen here on the left hand, or on the right-hand side rather, is, in a low pressure state, all of the guys on the left would then try to move over to the right, right? So basically you can think about fluids as like, hey, when it's high pressure, I'm trying to get to low pressure, right? Like that's why when you think about wind, like when you're walking outside and it's windy, that's basically pressure differentials where the wind is saying, hey, I'm in a high pressure area. I want to go to a lower pressure area and I want to average out the pressures, right? Because everybody's trying to find basically that common energy state, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, sounds like
Yep.
it does. Okay, so so I was hoping somebody would come up with this first explanation, right? So there's really kind of two common explanations that are sort of out there that I think a lot of people come across. The first is this Newton's third law explanation. Can anybody tell me what Newton's third law is?
Equal and opposite reactions.
Yep, exactly. Equal and opposite reaction, right? So Newton's third law says that basically for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? So it's basically saying that, how do I explain this? So basically what that's saying is that let's say that I actually push, so you can think about it like if I push on the wall, right? I'm pushing on the wall, but the wall is also actually pushing back on me, right? And that's why I'm not able to move the wall at all, right? And so let's think kind of quickly about like what that means, right? And so I'll talk about energy here a little bit, right? So if you think about, again, let's go back to that example of I'm, pushing a box across the floor, right? So basically what happens is that if we go back to that chart, right? If I start to push on the box, right, the box starts to push back on here, and you can see that there's kind of forces created in both ways, right? Let's think about a car, right? So when I put power down to wheels, I'm putting power down in this direction. What happens to the car? It moves forward, right? That's a third law effect, right? So the reason that the car is moving forward is because I'm actually at the wheel, putting down power, rotating this wheel, right, forcing it to rotate. That grip is then translating that into friction force that's being applied, in this direction. Reaction that the car has to have is to move forward. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? So that's Newton's third law. Okay, anybody, I kind of explained that quickly. Anybody have any questions on that? Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, sounds like it does. So the third law explanation is, hey, like if I have an airfoil and I have a fluid moving, right? That fluid hits the airfoil, it pushes the airfoil up, and then that fluid is deflected down, and that's what creates lift, right? So it's basically the reaction force of this fluid actually hitting the airfoil and this fluid having speed, hitting the airfoil, pushing that fluid up, pushing that airfoil up, and then this flow is deflected down. You generate lift, and you can and then so this airfoil generates lift, right? The second, which somebody else kind of hinted at, is this sort of what's known as this equal transit time explanation. And so that basically says if I have two air particles, and they both hit the front of the wing at the same time, the particle at the top has to travel a longer distance than the particle on the bottom, right? So it speeds up, it goes faster, pressure on the top of the wing drops, right? And then you get high pressure on the bottom of the wing. Now, can anybody tell me, like, why is this, like, what underlying physics require this equal transit time?
Surface tension?
No, surface tension wouldn't require that, right? Surface tension is a unique factor in water. If you want to understand that, I can explain that later, but that's kind of a molecular bond thing. That's not, surface tension doesn't exist in all fluids, right? It doesn't exist necessarily in air, those kinds of things. Anybody else have any theories? And please don't be shy about jumping in, right? I'd much rather have we go through these other potentially wrong answers, because it's more about the thought process than whether the answer is right or wrong.
All right. So how we approach this is more like, put your sump over the garden hose. The flow has to speed up to preserve the mass flow. So basically, at this point, we have something called Bernoulli's equation. So basically,
you're jumping ahead. Ken, can you just hold on till the end, because I'm going to explain that. Yeah.
No, I'm just trying to explain this in a simple term. But you go ahead.
Yeah. No, again, like I said, I appreciate it. Like, and I want you to kind of talk about it in more complex, but I just want to build some basic principles.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. So, can anybody else tell me? Is there any underlying physics that causes this to happen, where that molecule has to get to the back at the same time as this molecule? Any other ideas?
Sorry, what's the question?
Conservation of. It's almost like You know, like in a point on a wave kind of is
Yep.
not really moving despite it's moving up and down.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to understand what that actually is.
Yeah. So Dermot, I was asking, is there anything that, and I'll answer the question here, but there's this equal transit time explanation, which again says that if I think about the red and, let's just say that the blue and the red are two molecules and they hit this wing at the same time, the blue molecule has to go a further distance to get to the back of the wing than the red molecule on the bottom of the wing, and they get to this point at the same time. And so the question that I was asking, is there anything that's forcing that to happen, or what the physics are that's causing that to happen? The answer is that there's actually no underlying physics that's causing that to happen. This is sort of a misexplanation, right? But the reason that I wanted to explain both of these is because you can kind of combine these two concepts together, and you get to you start to begin to understand how lift is generated, right? It's both a reaction force, meaning that I'm hitting that wing, and so therefore it's getting deflected upwards, and then also this differential in pressure, and the fact that this has to transit a longer surface does lower the pressure, but there's nothing that says that it has to go get to the back here. So what happens in reality is this fluid speeds up, right? But because it, depending on the wing profile, this molecule will actually hit the back of the wing at a later time than this molecule on the bottom of the wing, right? So again, we're getting more complicated here. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. I'll kind of move on, and then, Ken, I think if you want to just jump in here, this will help, right? So I put this in here. So there's something called the Navier-Stokes equation, right? And this is what's known as conservation of a momentum, right? And so that basically says that there's like three major kind of Navier-Stokes equation. These are all partial differential equations. I just wanted you to see this. I'm not going to talk about what these actually mean. I just want you to know that it's complicated, right? Because these Navier-Stokes equations, this is kind of a quote, but the upshot of that quote is that these equations have never been fully solved mathematically, right? So what everybody does in practice is that they use computers, right, to try to solve these equations to kind of prescribe, and describe what's happening. And that's like, you saw that cow image, right? Like that's a numerical simulation where people are basically using these Navier-Stokes equations to simulate what's happening, right? And ACC, I don't know exactly, but my guess is ACC is using a simplified form of these equations to actually calculate what's happening over and under the car, right? So it's pretty complicated in terms of actually describing lift. All of the simple explanations are only partial explanations, and it's really a buildup of all of these other factors, right? So, anybody that tells you that they truly understand, all the ways that lift is created and kind of can perfectly mathematically solve for what lift would be over a wing is actually not telling you the truth, right? They can only describe that sort of locally. Okay, I'll stop there for questions, and then kind of let you go if you want to kind of give that your explanation. I think that was helpful as well. So any other comments before Ken kind of gives his explanation or questions? Did that make sense to everybody? Can I just get some feedback on whether that's making sense or not? I just want to make sure people aren't lost.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. How about somebody you haven't heard from? Evan, is that making sense?
I'm just soaking it in.
Okay. All right. Well, is it making sense? So that's what I want to know.
Oh yeah, you're doing a great job.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. Great. So again, if you guys, if it's not making sense, please don't be shy. It's an extremely complex topic, and I just want to try to explain it in a way that you guys understand. So Ken, go ahead if you wanted to give the explanation you were going to give.
Yeah, Rodricks is doing a pretty good job. I mean, Rodricks come from an engineering perspective, and let me talk about myself a little bit. I have a degree in aviation, and I do have a couple degrees in education as well. And I teach people how to fly planes, and I teach ground lessons as well. Principle of flight, well, right now we are trying to keep the car on the ground, which is opposite of flying. So basically the idea of understanding aerodynamic is first you have to understand air. And as Rodricks said, air is actually a fluid. It has mass, it has weight, and it has friction. So and then we put it on the car, and just like Rodricks said, is so basically we look at the car from the top, the air is traveling further on the top, then it's traveling further in the bottom. So we are eventually creating a lower pressure because just like us put a finger over the garden hose, the amount of liquid is the same, but now you have a higher pressure. And well, it's technically it flows faster, but at the same time, it is actually creating a lower pressure. Why? The thing is called Venturi. So how we get this is just
So let's not talk about the Venturi yet, because I'm
yeah,
gonna
I know.
that.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah.
Got it. But basically, that's the idea, and we just all I need to know is it creates a lower pressure, and yeah, and the amount of air is gonna be always constant because no matter what, we are going through the same amount of stuff. It's just how far it travels.
So in short, the further the air has to move, the lower the pressure is.
So that's sort of an explanation, right? And that's why I kind of showed here, right? That's a simplified explanation that relies on this equal transit time, explanation. But I also wanted to highlight, like, there's nothing that's forcing it, to get here at the same time. But there is a longer distance that it has to travel, right? But it's, I'll explain kind of next, like, what is really a different way to think about it. That's sort of kind of actually what's going on, or closer to what's actually going on.
So those particles aren't actually going up and under at the same time.
Correct.
Nothing's actually regulating that.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what I want you guys to understand. Like, when you hear that, right? Like, Ken is completely right. Like, it does have to travel a longer distance, right? So therefore, it has to, it speeds up, but it's actually the shape of the curve and that, it's kind of this combination of this deflection plus the shape of the curve that causes it to speed up. And then I think the next portion that I'll cover will also help you guys kind of build up that understanding, right?
Is that friction then?
In terms of what?
Like the air contacting the airfoil.
Yeah, so there's something actually called, so basically it's not really the Quanda effect, but I'll explain something called the Quanda effect. Like, so there's like Quanda effect in ducts, which basically says that air has like a certain stickiness, right? But I'll show you later, right? So let me explain some of this stuff, and I'll kind of answer that question because I want to show you a couple other things before I answer that. I can give you a better answer later. Okay, so I think that was Ben, so just Ben, hold that thought. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, thanks for jumping in, Ken, and providing kind of the other additional thought process. So again, like, I'm telling you this is super complicated. You can't solve it without a computer. Like, okay, that's not helpful to me, right? Like, how do I actually think about how airfoils work, right? And again, when I'm talking about an airfoil, that's what this is on the back, right? So you can look at the wing here, and you can see that it's basically an inverted wing, right? It's got kind of what's known as camber, which is basically, this kind of curvature to it, right? Where, again, as Ken said, you're basically causing this lower pressure by forcing the air to travel longer versus the bottom, right? Okay, so how do we think about that, right? So there's something called lifting line theory. And this is how I want you guys to think about how lift is generated. When I sit on an airplane, this is the theory that I think about because it's pretty easy to understand, and it helps you really understand in much more detail the other two kinds of theories that we talked about. So if you think about a wing, what you can really think about it is as it's a vortex that's traveling through the air, right? Now, what is a vortex? It's like a tornado. Like a tornado is a vortex, right? So a wing, in some sense, is really generating a mini tornado or a vortex in the air that's having circulation, right? So I won't go through all the reasons, but you can see here kind of the way that it's modeled in this lifting line theory, where if this is the airfoil, right, you can see that you can take any point along the line and say, okay, look, there's a vortex that's kind of in this plane. So I'll talk the plane of the lifting line, and then I'll talk the plane of the circulation, which is kind of this up and down. So there's these vortices that are going in, kind of curling inward, right? If you know more about aerodynamics, these are wingtip vortices that are kind of going inward, right? On this side of the wing, they're going towards the center of the wing, so they're rotating this way. On this side of the wing, they're going towards the center of the ring, so they're rotating the other way, right? They generate what's known as downwash, right? So if I kind of push this vortex and I think about what's happening, is it's pushing the air down. So all these vortices build up on top of each other where this is a downwash profile. So the amount of air that's being pushed, now if I think about this direction of the wing, right? Now I'm basically generating a giant vortex that's rotating in the direction of this incident velocity kind of direction here. You see what I'm saying? So what all these wingtip vortices are doing, right, is they're actually along this lifting line, they're generating circulation or a vortex that's moving around this lifting line, right? So if we go back and look at our wing, we can think about here, let's just draw a straight line across, right? And let's just collapse this wing down. So let's ignore that wing is here completely. If we could just draw a line and create a vortex in this direction, we would generate lift. Okay, does that make sense? So think of basically wings as vortex generation devices, and a wing you can basically think in your mind, like when you see an airplane, just think of that airplane as one giant vortex moving through the air, right? Again, same as a tornado. If you could put a tornado on its side and move it through the air, that tornado would go upwards because it would generate lift. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay. Anybody confused on that? This is kind of our foundational concept, so I want to make sure everybody gets this.
Is that because it's less dense in that vortex?
No, it's not because
it's
less dense, right? It has to do with this Bernoulli equation, but it's just the fact that that vortex, if you think about it, that vortex has a high pressure side and a low pressure side, right? Does that make sense, Ben? So let's go back to that vortex, right? So I said basically you have a vortex around this lifting line. Which side of the vortex is the high pressure side and which is the low pressure side?
Understood.
Can you answer the question, like which side is the high pressure side and which is the low pressure side?
Which side's the low pressure side? Which side's the high pressure side?
Yep.
The high pressure side's going to be on the bottom of this.
Correct. Yeah. So the high pressure side's on the bottom, right? The low pressure side's on the top of that vortex. Does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Again, I'll go back to everybody else. Please jump in. Does that make sense to everybody? Think of a wing as a vortex. That vortex has a high pressure side on the bottom of the vortex and a low pressure side on the top of the vortex.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm getting some thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Thanks for the feedback here, guys. Appreciate it. So now we need to think about the lifting line theory equation, right? So lift is equal to rho times V times gamma, where rho is density. This is a property of the fluid, right? So in air, we can basically assume that that density is the density of air. It's fixed, right? If I were to put this vortex in xenon, the density would be different. If I were to put it in water, the density would be different, right? That density is basically a property of the fluid that it's going in. V is velocity, so that's basically how fast you're going. And then gamma is this vorticity or circulation. That's how strong of a vortex you're generating, right? So let's go back to, kind of our model in ACC here, right? You can see the wing. The thing that really determines the vortex, how strong that vortex is basically the curvature of that wing. A simplified way to think about it is how curvy is that wing. The more curved it is, the stronger the vortex, right? And a lot of race cars, you'll see this. You can sort of see it here, what's called a gurney flap. I'm trying to zoom in, but I can't get a good shot of it. But you can see that there's just sort of this vertical, like, kind of tab that's attached to the top of this wing, right? That's known as a gurney flap. You look at the back of an Indy car. Sometimes they will run gurney flaps here. I don't know if any of you have seen kind of a Corvette from a couple of years ago. They had a really big kind of shitty gurney flap on the back. That's what that's doing basically, is it's increasing the amount of vorticity that this wing is generating, okay? Because it's kind of kicking that air over.
Could you call that a duckbill as well? Is that kind of the same concept?
A duckbill is slightly different.
Okay.
Because the duckbill is smooth and the duckbill is connected at the bottom, right? You see what I'm saying?
Okay, yeah.
Like you need that air to flow underneath the bottom of the wing.
Okay, yeah, cool, yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
So what was the comment here? Yep. Yeah, so let's do that. Brandon. So let's compare the EVO, right? So you can see the size of the wing, right? And then let's look at the other EVO. Again, this is much smaller, right?
You are talking about the curvature, the end, right? Okay.
So you can't see it because of the end plate here, but look at the top of the wing and you see there's like a curve to the top of the wing there, Durbin, right?
Yeah.
So it's that curvature that matters.
Thank you.
Okay, and then you can see the gurney flap much more clearly here, right? So you can see that at the back here, there's just this little flap that's attached. And you can basically think that's like kicking the air over very rapidly. So that's generating more vorticity, right? So let's look at a couple other car wings, right? So again, you can see, this is a really good one. So Durbin, can you see how, there's a different curve to the wing here on the Audi? And then again, this also has a gurney flap. But you see the difference between this and the other two Audi wings that we've shown?
Yes.
Okay, so that curvature is really what matters, right? So obviously the length of the wing matters, but really you can basically think of the amount, how strong of a vortex it's generating is based on the curve of this wing and then kind of the length of that wing and whether it has this gurney flap or not. I don't know if there's any cars in the game that don't have a gurney flap. Yeah, even the Jaguar has a gurney flap.
Rodricks, you can right click the mouse and move your camera. Hold the right button.
Oh, perfect. Yep. Thank you. Thanks for that, Ken. So like here, let's look on the Rex, right? So it doesn't really have much of a gurney flap here, right? But you can see the different curvature, right? So this is the curve that we're looking at, right? It's basically mirrored on the bottom side here. And then you can see that the curve changes throughout the wing, right? It's more in the center here and less at the edges. So there's going to be a stronger sort of vortex influence from the center wing, right? Let's look at a GT4 car, right? Not much curvature. There's the gurney flap, right? Okay. Look at the Porsche. Not much curvature at all, right? Just a gurney flap. Okay. Does everybody understand that?
So
Everybody.
is it correct to like kind of break down like the point of the wing is to kind of create a loop of the air over the wing and have the weight of that circulating air push down on the rear of the car?
So it's not the weight of that air, right? It's that is a correct way to think about it. Is that Waleed?
Yes.
Yeah. So the way to think about it, and I would slightly modify it, is the point of the wing is to generate that vortex. It's to get the air turning, right? Because the more the air turns, the stronger that vortex. Right?
Yeah, fighter jet vortex. You see it a lot in like F-18s when they're flying through mist and stuff. You'll see it.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good one. And then this is low pressure, right? So let's go back to the lifting line theory, right? So this vortex that goes around the wing is, in this philosophy, generated by the wingtip vortices, right? We can see the wingtip vortices kind of spilling off here. Now, these vortices are circulating in this direction, and then they're pushing the air behind the wing down, right? Or in this case, they're pushing it up rather, right? So they're pushing that air up, right? And then here in the airplane wing, they're pushing it down. That's generating a vortex that's going around this lifting line. Okay, and then to answer your question about the weight, it's not really weight, it's the amount of lift, but that lift is generated by, again, the density, so we can ignore that, but also the speed that you're going. So it's the speed times that vortex that's being generated that determines how much that wing is pushing down on the car. Does that help, Waleed?
Yeah.
Okay, is that making sense, or is it still a little unclear?
It's a little like, I get that it's not weight, like it's not like gravity pulling down on, but in my head it still is like it's force being pushed down on the wing as a result of the vortex.
Correct, yeah. That's the word that I would use, is it's force being pushed down on the wing. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions, or is it all making sense still?
Just real quick, sorry, I had to go AFK for a little while there.
Yeah.
Earlier you had mentioned that we would circle back to talking about the aerodynamics as far as you had mentioned D5, D6 guys might be wanting to start there.
I'll be coming.
That point?
No,
oh, okay.
no, I'll
Gotcha,
do that
gotcha.
next. Yeah, so you haven't missed
Perfect.
that yet.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
It might not make 100% sense to you because you missed some of that, but I'll cover that, right?
Awesome.
Okay, so let's take a look at the car, right? And let's maybe look at some of the aerodynamic devices on a car. So let's look at the 488 because that's what I'll be driving. Oh, don't want to. I gave you guys a little sneak preview there, unfortunately, of the livery. But let's think about the vortex generation devices, right? So the wing is an obvious one, right? Now, I'll just give you the answer here because I think we're almost an hour in, but look at some of these cars. They have the wing attached to the bottom, right? Other sort of newer cars have the wing attached to the top, right? And you'll see this mostly in Formula One cars. They'll come over the front, like the old Evo did. This is known as a swan neck. And so basically, what they're trying to do is they're trying to attach the high pressure to the high pressure side of the wing, because that air is less sensitive to disruption than the low pressure side of the wing, right? But cars like the Ferrari, you know, they're okay kind of disrupting that low pressure side of the wing a little bit, right? So now let's look at some of these other overbody. We'll talk about underbody aerodynamics. Let's only focus on overbody items, right? So what do you guys think that this stuff is doing right here?
Which part?
This right here. this
Generating
little-
downforce.
Front downforce, yeah.
Yep.
And so how's it doing that, right? Think about what I talked about in terms of how
So
much
it's the same pressure, right? The air
Yeah.
flows over the top, and because there's more. I'm not a scientist.
Yeah.
It's flowing up, right? So the wind's going to
Yeah.
catch it and push the front down.
So that's deflection, right? What else is
Deflection.
it doing? Yeah. So what else is it doing?
Vortices.
It's
That's the
directing.
operative word. Yeah, that's the opposite word. Who said that? The vortex?
The vortices. Yeah,
Yeah. Who is that? Sorry,
that has been.
okay. Ben. Yeah. So again, think about this is what I'm like trying to instill in you guys, right? Like before everything else, think about the vortex, right? Like this is generating a little mini vortex right here, right? You know, this is generating a large vortex, right? The mirrors that are coming off here, there's a little air that's spilling off, and that's generating vortices. All of those kinds of things, right? Think about think about the wheel turning inside here, right? Why is it that they have these cutouts behind the wheel and they have these slots over the wheel arch, right? Because the wheel is turning, right, in this direction, right? Remember what we said, the low pressure side and the high pressure side? Inside the wheel arch, you know, it's generating this high pressure. You need to relieve that high pressure. So these slots and these kind of gaps here are all to allow that pressure to exit, right? When you look at the back wheel here, and why is the body cut away right behind the wheel? It's all to relieve that high pressure region and the vortex that the wheel is generating because it's turning in the air, right? Let's look at a Formula One car real quickly. Right, so let's see if we can get kind of a close-up, right? So what is everything doing here, right? This is generating a vortex. This is generating a vortex. These right here, right? This is flowing the air so that it can get here. This is generating a vortex, right? These are aerodynamically shaped, right? They're not just round because of the fact that they need to generate a vortex as well. The wing mirrors, they're generating that vortex, right? These little wings off the top here, those are generating vortices. If you look at the floor here, right, the fact that there's these slots, right, what they're trying to do is they're trying to seal the floor here. How are they doing that? They're basically forcing, you know, kind of that low pressure air from the bottom to spill over and circulate right through these slots. That's sealing the floor. Again, that's generating a vortex, right? When you look at, you know, the front of a wing, and it's kind of, you know, there's this vortex tunnel right here. If I can get an image of the front wing here. Yeah, let's look at this right here, right? This is called a vortex tunnel, right? So on the Aston Martin, you can see there's this little appendage sticking out. That's known as a vortex tunnel. That's basically rolling up a vortex underneath and firing that down the outside of the tire, right? So everywhere you look along every single aerodynamic device here, right? What I want you to see in your mind is it's generating this little vortex, right? And that vortex is what's generating downforce. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, all right. I think that's the most important concept, and that's the right way to think about, the most efficient way to think about lift, right? So that strength of the vortex, as I go faster, I get more downforce from this equation, okay? And now, so what do we do in practice, right? Like I said, those Navier-Stokes equations are very numerically intensive to solve. They're very difficult, right? Basically, they measure this empirically, and so they will put a wing in the wind tunnel, and you know, precursor to NASA, they developed hundreds of different airfoils, and they basically put them in wind tunnels, and they generated what are known as these CL versus alpha plots, right? And so the reason this is important is because I want you to think about alpha. When you look at when you click the wings, right, when it says 1 to 12, it's basically changing the angle at which the wing sees the airflow, what's known as the angle of attack. That's the CL. Again, think of CL as what is the strength of my vortex, right? So if I increase the angle between the wing and the air, so going back here, if I increase this angle, right, that increases the strength of the vortex, right, and you get more lift, right? So that's when you go into the ACC screen and you say, how do I click my wing up? That's basically what it's doing, is it's changing this angle. Okay. Okay. Any questions on that? I know we covered a lot there. Is all of that clear? Okay. Sounds good. So again, that's what you need to know about overbody aerodynamics, right? So all the surfaces on the top of the car, you guys basically now understand how they work and how they generate downforce. So here's a different question. When I look at the shape of a car, what does it look like?
A wing?
Yeah. In which direction?
Upside down.
Well, this is an upside down wing, right, in the back, right?
Yeah.
If an airplane is a right side up wing, right?
Oh,
that's
yeah.
the shape
This is an airplane wing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right. So the car naturally wants to generate lift, wants to take off, right? So all of this other stuff is kind of basically pushing that background into the ground, right? But it's kind of interesting, right? Ideally, a car would be shaped like this, right? It would be shaped like an upside down wing, but we can't really drive it that way, right? Because we wouldn't be able to see out, right? Okay. Again, any questions on that before we go to underbody downforce? You guys are a quiet group. I was hoping for some more questions here.
Sounds like the main takeaway about this is we need to understand the shapes and how they actually create vortices over the body to generate downforce.
That's a great way to put it, Ben. Okay.
Is there any tips? Like, would you ever say that perhaps for somebody in D5, D6, such as myself, and I haven't fallen in love with an exact model of car yet, would you say there's any merit to just going through and looking at the cars based on everything we've talked about and seeing the
No, because
angles?
you're not going to be able to tell from your eye because it's so complicated.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Yeah. There's no way that like anybody can just look at it. Like maybe Adrian Newey, who's like the chief designer of Red Bull, he can do that, but he's got like 50 years of wind tunnel data in his head, right? So
Sure.
okay. Ken, do you guys have any other simplified explanations for that you guys used, or?
So your explanation is pretty good. I do like the way you talk about the vortex generating the lift, which is I do not use because they are not cough FAA approved, but it's a good way to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Perfect. So let's talk about underbody dynamics, right? So again, I think this is what Ken was talking about. Why don't you go through, Ken, and explain what the Venturi effect is?
Yeah, I was actually talking about the reason I talk about Venturi effect is not only for talking about underbody aerodynamics, it's actually talking about the overbody aerodynamics, because as Rodricks just explained to you guys, the car itself is eventually a gigantic wing and is producing lift all the time. The faster you go, it's producing more lift, and it has a chance that it's going to take off, just like Mark Webber or the recent U.S. Grand Prix and Fernando Alonso. You lost some of the lift, give you a little bit pivot point, the whole car just flies off. So the Venturi effect is how we counteract with it. So basically the idea is we have a high pressure, we basically force everything, just like, again, garden hose, right? Garden hose, we put a little bit, we use a finger to have it a high, to increase the speed. At the same time, it has lower pressure. And basically that's just how Venturi effect works, and it's used on the cars because it basically creates a suction for us in the underbody to make sure our car sticks on the ground.
Yep, that's exactly right. So that's really what's happening in your underbody. Now, I think when you think about the underbody is like, let's think about a tube, basically, right? Like let's say water through a pipe, right? If I have water through the pipe, I have that constricted and constrained in a way that I don't have in the air, right, in the outside. So I have a certain amount of mass or a certain amount of liquid that's in that pipe, and it's going a certain speed as it's flowing through, right? If I constrict that pipe, if I choke it down the same way that I do by putting my finger over garden hose, that same amount of fluid or that same amount of water has to go through the tube, right, in a smaller area. How does it do that? It speeds up, right? So if I were to basically take a slice here and a slice here, right, and I were to basically say over 1 second, how much water goes through, it would be the same amount of water, right? Because the areas are different. But the speed is higher here, right? So that's basically what's happening in the Venturi effect. If I take a fluid, I take that same amount of mass of fluid and I constrict it down, and that fluid is moving and I constrict it down, that fluid has to speed up, it drops pressure. Okay? Does that make sense? Clear? Okay, sounds good.
Yep.
Okay, so let's look at kind of these are some aerodynamic maps, right? So you can see, let's go with this one. I think this is actually a better one, right? So let's look at the front of the car, right? So everybody thinks like, oh, it's a diffuser that, at the back it's creating downforce. Well, look at the actual pressure maps here, right? Blue is areas of low pressure. It's where that air first hits that constriction point that the pressure drops, right? So if I go back to my Ferrari, it's when it hits this splitter here, that's basically taking a bunch of air and it's forcing it to go underneath the body. So that air has to speed up. It's got to drop pressure. Okay. So when I increase rake, meaning that I increase my rear ride height and drop my front ride height, basically I'm moving that constriction closer to the ground. I'm forcing that air to speed up more. And so the actual point, again, going back to our friction thing, where does the actual pressure act, or where does the normal force act? It's all acting basically in this area right here. That's where the low pressure area is. When I look at a diffuser, it's not as much acting here. It's more acting at the point, if you were to look into the car, where that diffuser starts, right? Same as you can see here. That is the area where the low pressure regime is. Basically what the diffuser is doing is it's basically trying to return that pressure back to ambient. It's trying to return that air back to ambient pressure, so you don't generate drag, right? So that's basically what the diffuser has, this entire shape, right? Because the constriction actually is occurring at the front of the diffuser. The constriction is occurring at the front of the car. That's where the actual low pressure area is, and that's where the downforce is mostly acting. Okay, same thing. Look at the, these are the new 2021 cars, right? They have these Venturi tunnels, and everybody talks about ground effect, right? Basically, I'm taking that air and using the ground as one side of that tunnel, constricting the air, forcing it to accelerate. When I'm introducing that constriction at first, that's where my low pressure is generated. And then when I actually go and add my diffuser and I basically restrict it again, right, and change the area that the air is in, then I get another low pressure area. And so that's where all the downforce is acting. You can see the 2020 cars here, right? Again, you can see this is the bottom, right? So you can think about the wing in the front on a Formula One car. It's constricting that area or that flow that's flowing beneath the wing. In our GT3 cars, the splitter is doing the same thing. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, so to kind of get my brain on the same page there, you had mentioned that there's an increase in airflow going underneath that front wing or that front splitter, right? So naturally, my brain wants to think, okay, well, that's going to increase lift and try to raise that front wing or front end of the car up. But because it's a low pressure zone, you're saying the Venturi effect is kind of at play there. And so we have a combination of the low pressure zone underneath the front splitter and then a high pressure zone above the rear wing to kind of balance it out?
No, so that's why I explained it in these two parts, right? The overbody aerodynamics works in a completely different way than underbody aerodynamics, right? So I think about half of what you said there was correct, right, Nate? So let's go back to the car. So the splitter is creating a low pressure underneath.
Sure.
And if you think about the rake of the car, the rake is going to be, kind of in this way if I exaggerate it really.
Okay.
The air is going to deflect and it's going to push down, right? In the wing, right, like the low pressure zone is here. The high pressure, sorry, is that what you said? You said the low pressure zone is
The
underneath?
low pressure zone's below the rear wing, and a high pressure zone above the rear wing. But I'm
Yep.
not sure if. Okay.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, I misunderstood. I thought you were saying the high pressure is underneath. No, yeah, in a race car wing, yes, the high pressure is on top.
Gotcha. And
Yep.
and that's where you were talking about the Venturi effect, with the increase of airflow underneath the front splitter is kind of offset by the low pressure zone that's being generated there.
So the thing that's not correct there is the increase in airflow. Remember, I gave my
Oh.
example of a pipe here, right?
Right.
So the way you can think about it is that there's no more air flowing underneath the car, right? There's basically a fixed amount of air, because that air, there's only a certain amount of air that can get underneath, right?
Sure.
And so that airflow is basically constant throughout. You can basically simplify it and say the amount of air that's underneath the car at one point is basically constant, because it's constricted by the car, the floor of the car and the ground.
Okay.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yep. 100%.
So the
Okay.
Venturi effect, is that vortices down there?
No, it's not vortices.
Okay,
There are no
that's what-
vortices underneath. Yeah.
That's what I was want to make sure.
Yep, and that's a great point, right? And that's why I covered this overbody versus underbody, right? It's a completely different phenomena that's occurring here. They both rely on this Bernoulli principle concept of high and low pressure, and air wants to move from areas of higher pressure to areas of lower pressure. But the Venturi effect has nothing to do with how wings generate downforce, right?
It's
It has
kind of
nothing.
closer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I gotcha.
It has nothing to do with how these little devices on the car are generating downforce, right? It's purely because of this fact where I'm taking the same amount of flow and I'm forcing it to go through a narrow area, and therefore it has to speed up and drop pressure.
Okay, so it's not an increase in airflow; it's just an increase of velocity of the airflow that is kind of the
Yep.
same amount of airflow. Okay.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yep. Ben, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody else had a question?
Yeah. So, do you still have that picture of the Aston Martin up, the F1?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So the front wing is generating vortices like through those slits, right? Because you got to get the air between both sides.
Mm-hmm.
But then that thing in that middle, like, is that also trying to induce a Venturi effect to bring low pressure air to the bottom of that car?
This right here.
After that, like that little slit after it, that thing, yeah.
So this right here is what you're talking about.
Straight down the middle, like yeah, that, and then if you go down that little.
This right here.
The gap between the nose and the wing and the split.
Yeah, so that's basically just trying to get air to flow underneath the car. So it's not generating any downforce here. What they're basically trying to say is we want to get air underneath the car to take advantage of the Venturi effect. And if this was not open, then that would basically be a wall that the air can't pass through.
Okay, and then second question. So why do the front wings have flaps? Is that like instead of just one solid?
Yeah, that's a complicated question.
Okay.
So I can try to explain that in a simplified way, but let's go back to this picture, right? Basically, you can think about if each one of those vortices, you see there's all these little vortices, that I'm kind of using in this model, right? That I'm like saying there's a vortex at every point, and then the strength of the bigger vortex, like the strength of this main vortex is increasing. What those flaps are trying to do is basically this generates a vortex, it interacts with this vortex, the combined vortex gets stronger, then it interacts with this. So basically, there's a little vortex here that forces this bigger vortex to work harder, right? And it also goes back to that that Newton's third law, right? This vortex sees this vortex. Because of that reaction force, that air has to work harder. This vortex becomes bigger. So all of these flaps basically make this main wing work harder, right? So this flap makes this wing work harder, it increases the strength of that vortex. This vortex, pushes against this wing, and therefore it has to work harder. So these wings are sort of acting in opposition to each other, with the goal of making the one in front of it work harder because it sees the vortex from the one behind.
Oh, yeah, that's actually pretty cool.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Other questions? These are great questions. Keep them coming, guys. Everybody understands everything about car aerodynamics, I assume now. Okay.
Absolutely not, but I'm getting there.
Yeah. Durbin, were you saying something? Okay, maybe not. I thought I.
Yes.
Okay, good.
How much of this goes into ACC?
So I think the thing that goes into ACC that I told you about is I think they're using these simplified Navier-Stokes equations.
So do they actually simulate all of these gurney flaps and things we were talking about?
Yes, yeah. Yep, they do.
This helps inform us what's actually changing as we manipulate the setup.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They just basically reduce the amount of simulations you have to run, but they still run the simulations.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, most of the stuff is run on, extremely high-end computers. As Ken said, like, these are actually not the full Navier-Stokes equations. These are simplified versions of them, two-dimensional versions of them. So my guess is that they are running very, very simplified versions. And the other thing that you can think about is how many calculations, like how many points I simulate that at. So let's say across the wing, I could simulate, 10 different points across the wing. If I'm, Boeing and I'm building a wing, I will simulate 10,000 points across the wing, right? So it's the number of points that they're doing to simplify as well. But it's those basic equations, right? Okay, what everybody's been waiting for, the setup conversation. So before I go into that, does anybody have any questions?
What did you major in? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, and I think you missed that at the beginning, Nate, is aerospace engineering. So
man, that's bad.
Yeah, so let me I forgot to explain one other thing. Okay, so then now let's take all this together, right? Now, there's something called the aerodynamic center, right? So that's the center of the pressure. So if I can just get, like, I don't know if you guys can hand raise or give a thumbs up, like how many of you took calculus? Okay, so we got
User.
Okay, so I got a couple, so a number of people that talk about calculus, right? So great. So most folks have had calculus in some way or another. So think about if I were to take all those little forces, right, all those pressures, and I were to integrate them over the entire car, I could basically assume that those act at one point, right? So the point at which they act is basically that center of pressure. So if I were to be basically able to sum up all those forces, right, and say, okay, well, if I had to basically take all the forces that are pointing upwards versus the forces that are pointing downwards, and I were to basically say, okay, how do those act across the car? That's basically what's known as the center of pressure, right? The point at which I can simulate all of those forces acting on the car where they would be in balance. And then that tells me how much load is being put onto my individual tires, right? Now, I couldn't find this for a car. I found it for an airplane, so I'm using an airplane. But what really matters for how well the car rotates, all of that kind of stuff, like where the setup is in ACC, is where the center of gravity is. So if I integrate across the entire car, or airplane in this case, and I say, okay, where is the gravity force? Like, so where's all the mass balanced behind and in front? The difference between that and the center of pressure is what determines, that is basically the ratio that matters. In aircraft, this is something called, static margin, basically. So in aircraft, the center of gravity is always ahead of the center of pressure. Same thing in rockets. The center of gravity is always ahead of the center of pressure, because if the center of pressure was in front, right, then you would not have stability for the aircraft. That's probably an aside, and I'm sure if you guys have questions, Ken can tell you more about static margin. But yeah, it's the center of pressure that matters, right? So it's basically where I'm summing up all the forces. Okay, does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah,
can I get some thumbs up here? Okay, okay, great. So let's jump into ACC. Let's jump into the setup. So let's go to the aero screen here, right? So let's think about the wing, right? So I showed you, let's not use the audio. That's not a very pitch sensitive car. Let's go to something else that shows this better. Does anybody drive a car that they know is very pitch sensitive?
The Porsche?
Is the Mercedes like that?
I don't know, but I can tell you that the Porsche is definitely, yeah. So let's go look at the Porsche. So let's look at the Porsche here. So we can basically look at the wing, right? It's got a big old rear wing, right? And then it's got a short wheelbase, right? So if we look at the center of pressure, my guess is, it's probably, as we said, we want that center of pressure to be somewhere aft. So let's maybe say that it acts at the back of the door handle here. Let's just assume that that's our center of pressure. We don't really know, but let's just keep that point in mind as we're going into the actual setup screen, right? So this is showing a reference point right here. So this front arrow variation, right, is saying, okay, relative to this reference point, how far am I moving that center of pressure relative to my reference point? So like it's expressed as a percentage. So it's some distance from the reference point. So they have basically said, okay, there's a center of pressure. There's some reference point that we're going to start with. As I change the balance, that's going to change where, my center of pressure is relative to kind of what my original reference was. So if I decrease, right, what that tells you is that, when there's a lot of wing, that is moving the center of pressure backwards, right? Because I'm putting more force on the back here. This is a stronger vortex. I'm moving that center of pressure backwards. I'm generating more stability, right? Think of the airplane example that I gave you, right? When I take all of that off, now it moves forward, and now I'm ahead of that reference point, right? So now it's going to be really on the nose, a lot more on the nose, right? If I take the splitter all the way down and I put the ride height all the way up, now I'm 14% basically above that. So my center of pressure now, whereas before, let's say that it was acting here, now it's acting here. So think about the normal force and the friction, right? If my normal force is acting here, which side of the car has a lot more weight, has a lot more friction has a lot more grip capability because of that friction equation?
The front
side.
Yeah, front side of the car, right? You got very little downforce acting over the rear. That point is here, right? It's going to be a nightmare to drive because the back has no grip. It's going to be very pointy because you got a ton of grip on the front. So it's going to be very responsive, almost undrivable, right?
What if you're in a front wheel drive car?
Well, you've already got more weight over the front, so it's going to be even worse.
Right.
Yeah, and remember what I said at the beginning, right? If you're thinking about low-speed corners, then where the weight is naturally matters, right? So like a Porsche is going to have more grip in low-speed corners, but when it comes to high-speed corners, it doesn't really matter whether the engine is as much in the front or the back, right? At least from an aerodynamic perspective, because of the fact that it's overwhelmed by the aerodynamics that are being generated rather than the weight of the car itself, right?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Why wouldn't raising the rear make the variation move backwards? Because the rear has more angle now.
Yep, good question. So let's go back to the image that we showed here. Remember I showed you that what matters is where the constriction is, right? And that's where most of the downforce is acting. Do you remember that? So let's go look at the car now. So if I go back and look at the car, and I have a super high rear end, right? You can see kind of the stance. Now, what I've basically done is I've really constricted here at the front. And so there's not a big gap here. All of that downforce is acting right at the front here, right? So there's a lot more, so the pressure in the front part of the car is a lot lower here. What the whole rake of the car is doing is simply trying to recover that pressure to ambient pressure so that you don't generate drag, right? So you've changed the amount of downforce that's being generated by that little kink at the diffuser, and you've moved that forward so that more of it's being generated here up front to be generated at the splitter. Okay, so if I go back here and I were to plot that with a lot of rake, this would be very blue up here, and it would be less blue at this point, right? And you would potentially have higher pressure. Does that answer your question, Dervin?
Yes.
Okay. I got to go back to this. Is making me crazy. Okay. So let's go back to the setup screen here, right? So what you want to think about is if I go compare the safe pre-setup, right? So here it's got -4. It's fairly low rake, right? If I wanted to make it more stable, I would raise the front, right? And what happened? That center of pressure moved backwards, right? so it's more stable now, right? Again, I can move it forward here. Now let's say that I go completely 0. Now that I've even passed the reference point, and now it's going forward, right? Let's take this all the way down, right? Now now the car is flat, right? Well, 53. Now the car is flat. You can see that there's 0 front to rear aero variation, because this is basically the point at which the center of pressure is exactly on the reference point that they're measuring from, right? So you guys can play with any car and say, okay, what is the point at which my center of pressure is exactly at the reference point? That's when it's 0, 0, right? And they're sort of giving you a hint here when it says base ride height is 65 rear, 60 front, right? So if you go to 65 here, and you go to 60 front, right? How much wing do we have to put on or take off? Basically between 7 and 8. That's kind of where we get to the neutral point at the base ride height. Okay? Does that make sense? So when you guys are basically thinking about this and you say, hey, look, my car has too much, like it's too pointy, it's too oversteery. What do I want to do, right? I want to increase the rake a little bit. And GT3 cars, the older ones in particular, are very pitch sensitive. Some cars are very pitch sensitive. Cars like the Audi Evo 2 are not very pitch sensitive, so you got to do this with the wing, right? But let's say that I'm driving, I'm a D5, Nate, back to your question, I'm a D5 driver. The car is oversteering too much, I can't control it. I want to go in ACC, right? And I want to do 1 click. The biggest thing that's going to have the impact is the front ride height. Maybe I want to go 1 click higher on the front ride height, right? Make it a little bit more stable. If I want to try to tune it more, I can lower the rear ride height. You can see that it has much less of an effect because it's that constriction that I talked about at the front that matters. But I can kind of lower it, and then I can sort of fine tune if it's just a little bit oversteery, right? And then if I want to have also large effects, I can raise the wing or I can lower the wing. So let's say that the car is too stable, right? It won't turn. The thing that I would go and do is I would say, okay, I'm going to go 1 click lower on the front ride height. I'm going to move that aerodynamic center. It's going to be more on the nose. It's going to be more pointy. Hopefully that'll solve it, right? I could also do that by lowering the rear ride height or lowering the rear wing, increasing the rear ride height. But the order of magnitude impact is that the rear wing has the largest impact. The front ride height has the second largest impact, and it depends how close you are. When you're, when you're not very close to the ground, it has less of an effect. You can see here 5.1 versus 4.6. If I'm very close to the ground, going from 53 to 37, again, you can see that it has a larger effect, right? So I basically have, a 7% effect here versus here I have, a 5% effect, right? So that's how I would think about it in terms of my setup. I wouldn't spend all my time worrying about mechanical grip, right? That only matters for low speed corners. And I think, you're not going to find that much speed because you're going to be running a lot of traction control anyway. That's sort of taking care of that. Really think about the more medium to high speed corners and like where you can actually gain time through the setup, right? The other thing is I'm sort of saying that, aerodynamics doesn't matter that much for low speed corners, but it does have an impact insofar as the pinch sensitivity matters. Because if my car is very pitch sensitive, and also if I were, another tip that I would say is if I'm an earlier driver or a slower driver in ACC, I would pick a car that I know is not very pitch sensitive, right? So let's go to the Audi Evo 2. They specifically designed this for gentleman drivers, basically, or amateur drivers. And one of the things that they did from the Evo 1 is they really took out the pitch sensitivity, right? So I look at the arrow here, I can go all the way down, compare this to the Porsche, right? Look at the percent change. It's 3-4% change for me going,
minimal.
7 millimeters difference, right? If I went 1 click lower on the Porsche, it was the same magnitude effect, right? So if you want to, to your point about car selection, Nate, like pick a car that's not that pitch sensitive if you're earlier on, right?
All right. So I picked the Aston Martin. Tell me how I fucked up.
No, so I think the Aston Martin is a really good beginner car actually,
Okay.
right?
All right.
For various other reasons, but let's look at the pitch sensitivity of the Aston Martin, right? So going again to the arrow, right? Let's look at the percent change. So 5/10, yeah, decent, right? Not quite as bad as the Porsche. Does have some aero sensitivity, right? And then I'll tell you guys one other trick, right? So the other thing to look at is the bump stops, right? So the bump stops here, if you look at this graphic, you have the spring. That's basically how stiff the front of your car. And this little red thing is the bump stop, right? If I lower the bump stop, you can see the red line moves down, and it basically sits on top of the end of the spring here. So moving the bump stop down, it's nonlinear, and as I hit that bump stop, it increases the spring rate, and it reduces the amount that the nose of the car wants to pitch down, right? Now, the counter to that is it really makes it difficult to go over bumps, and that's why you see it high here, because like it's gonna kill you over curves in some sense, because your wheel is gonna want to jump up in the air. But if it's like, yeah, I'm under braking, because of that pitch sensitivity, I'm losing the rear of the car. One thing that you can do in the mechanical grip section is lower the bump stops 1 or 2 clicks, or increase the bump stop rate, do it evenly to both sides, and that will help control the aero sensitivity of the car. Now don't do that in the rear. Remember what I said is the front of the car is really what matters a lot more for pitch sensitivity. If you're struggling with oversteer and you see that the bump stops are low, just go to basically, like really increase the bump stops, because what happens is as the weight shifts backwards and you sit on those bump stops, the car starts to lose mechanical grip, right? So again, if I were a beginner, I would focus on not worrying about, moving bump stops in the rear. I would probably move them up quite a bit, as you see here in the save pre-setup. But I would say, okay, let me work on my aero sensitivity first. Let me maybe move my bump stops 1 or 2 clicks. And then the rest of the time, I'm going to focus on on improving my driving and my driving line, right? And if the car feels loose, move that center of pressure backwards, right, by increasing rear wing, increasing rear ride height, or lowering rear ride height. If it's too understeery, then you can lower the rear wing, increase the rear ride height, and then lower the front ride height.
Gotcha. Okay. That's awesome. Just real quick to kind of recap on that. Is there any sort of like rule of thumb that one should be cognizant of, I suppose? Kind of like how, the tire temperature, you want to stay within, I don't know, what was it, 75 or something like that?
Unfortunately, no, because every single car is different. So
Gotcha.
where that center of pressure sits, and like where as I showed you, the sensitivity of different cars is very different. There's no rule of thumb, unfortunately, because each car aerodynamic is designed so differently.
I gotcha. Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to go around the room real quickly here. Ben, you have any other questions, or does that make sense?
The reference point that you're talking about, does knowing its specific point, how is that determined, or does that even really matter?
It doesn't even
having a sense of that point.
Yeah, it doesn't even matter, right? So the thing that matters is know that there is a reference point, know that is what that reference point is, and you're moving relative to that reference point, right? So I'm just trying to tell you, like, that when that percentage is showing there, what matters is the percent change when you make 1 click higher or lower rear ride height or anything else, right? But that is what they're doing in ACC, or what they're simulating.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep. Brandon, any questions from your side? Sounds like not. Doug Lee. Okay.
All good.
Okay, good. Durbin?
Is the bump stop rate how much stiffer it gets?
So the bump stop is basically, so that is the spring rate of the bump stop at 10 millimeters of deflection. So the bump stop is nonlinear, meaning that it's basically an elastomer, like a piece of rubber, that the more you compress it, the stiffer it gets. And so the bump stop rate that they're showing you is what that spring stiffness is at 10 millimeters of deflection in ACC.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Okay. Elliot?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Evan?
Could you summarize again when and what the effects are of touching the bump stops?
Yeah, so I think bump stops are an interesting topic. That's sort of non-aerodynamic, but I'll talk about it, right? So
I've touched them and have no idea what it does. I just know find some sweet spot where it feels better, but I have no idea what it physically does.
So let me explain springs really quickly, right? So I'll explain what springs are, right? So this spring equation equals negative k times x, right? Again, looks very familiar to our friction equation, but it has nothing to do with that, so don't get fooled, right? So the force, and then this is equal to mass times acceleration, right? So if I go to a spring, springs are, they have, they impact, well, these are nonlinear springs. I don't want to show those. Let's go to a coil spring like this, right? So, so let's go to a spring like this, right? So the spring has a certain, what's known as spring constant, right? That's the K in this equation, okay? And so that means that for every millimeter that I compress the spring, right? That's kind of sort of what you can think of the reactive forces. Now, X is the displacement. So if this is my natural level of the spring, the more I compress the spring, the more that force is, right? So basically what happens is if you look at a spring kind of displacement plot, it'll be linear, okay? So as I change the, so my force increases linearly, right? So let's just say that K is 10, right? Right, and then the displacement in millimeters that I'm doing is 1, right? So if I displace it 1 millimeter, my spring force is 10. If I displace it 2 millimeters, my spring force is 20. Okay, does that make sense?
Yep, got that.
Okay, so now let's go look at the bump stop. Now the bump stop is nonlinear, right? So that K value changes the more that I change X, right? So what happens is that when you go to the mechanical grip screen, right, this wheel rate is you're changing what that K value is. You can see here it's Newton per meter. So that meter is the amount of displacement that I get. So if I go 1 meter, I generate 155,000 newtons of force, right? If I go to, change it, then for 1 meter that I compress the spring, which I can never actually compress at 1 meter, but you get the point, right? Like I would generate 165,000 newtons of force, right? The bump stop, this 800 newtons is what the spring rate is at 10 millimeters of deflection. But if I were to deflect that bump stop 20 millimeters, the bump stop rate could be double or triple. It all depends on the type of rubber material that they're using, right? So the point of the bump stop is that when I hit that, I basically don't want to bottom out the car, right? And I also want to control the pin sensitivity of the car. So I want something that when I hit it, it's non-linear so that it really controls the downward pitch of the car. So by moving the bump stops down, right, most GT3 cars are designed so that you ride on the bump stop. So if you look at the aggressive preset setup here, right, well, this is the Aston, for whatever reason, doesn't ride on that. Let's go to a different car, and I'll show you that. Even a bump stop like click of setting is pretty low. But let's pick another car that I know like really rides on the bump stop. So I think the Ferrari does that. Yeah, so here you can see on the safe it's 4, on the aggressive setup, again it's 4. And again, you can look at this red line, that's where the bump stop is. So basically that bump stop is sitting actually down here. Even though the graphic it looks like at the top, it's actually sitting down here. So basically the spring is riding on the bump stop all the time, right? So your effective spring rate is this plus this amount. And this, like I said, as I compress it more, is non-linearly increases. So if I think about under braking, what happens? The car pitches down. I compress that bump stop more. It resists that pitch down at an exponential rate. Whereas if I just had a spring, it would have to travel a lot because that only compresses linearly and only has an impact linearly, right? So that's probably more detail than you were looking for, but that's basically what the bump stop does. So your question of how do I know if I'm hitting the bump stop? You're basically riding on the bump stop all the time. right? And you want to be doing that particularly in the front. In the rear, if you like were to go out and test, right? Like try going around a low speed corner and then slam the accelerator and then, look at the weight shift and then the car will start to slide. That's you hitting the bump stop in the rear, right? And you usually don't want to ride on the bump stops in the rear because of the fact that it makes it so that the wheel doesn't track the ground and you lose grip. It basically breaks traction, right? So if your car is really, and you can use this as a D1 driver to tune how much the car rotates, right? So if the car is not rotating enough under power, you can say, okay, well, I wanna take my bump stop down 1 or 2 so that I ride more on the bump stop. So when I actually go under acceleration, I make it so that the wheel doesn't track as much. I have less friction force. The car moves around more because the wheels are sliding more. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Was that too much, or is that like I want to make sure it's like
probably
clear.
a little too much, but no, that makes sense why the fronts and the rears are different.
Okay. Okay.
And yeah, like just the basic turn them down if you want more rear end rotation makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you think about it, and if it's still unclear, you want to talk about it more, feel free to DM me. Go ahead, Durbin.
How much do you want the car to not pitch downwards under braking?
The more you can control the pitch, the more stable it would be. Ideally, you would have no pitch because then the car would always act the same. Pitch is what creates variability, so that's why the car acts differently at turn in, through the corner, kind of coming out. In an ideal state, if I was a perfect car designer, I would get no pitch sensitivity, meaning that the pitch of the car would not change at all. Okay, Queso? Any questions, Queso? Okay, sounds like not. Gnarly? Okay, no question. Jack? Okay, no question. John?
Yeah, dude, thank you for explaining all of it. It was a nice fluid dynamics refresher for me. But
cool.
when we're talking about the aero, and I listened to Neil's video that he had about setup, and he always talks about balance of the car and balance. But it seems like that front ride height is just going to determine so much with these cars right off the bat.
Yep. Now, I think part of what he's talking about with balance is as weight shifts forwards and backwards, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's sounds like you have some kind of engineering training. So basically, the way that because of that weight, it's not actually weight shifting, it's a momentum effect, meaning the car wants to keep going when you try to slow it down. So then what happens is that it kind of gets that pitch downwards, the car compresses the front spring more, it lowers down, that aero center moves forward, then it becomes looser in the rear, right? So when he talks about balance of the car, right, he's talking number one about how does the car react outside of pitch. That's where the aerodynamic center is, and that determines how much grip is in the front versus the rear. That's what he's talking about, balance. And then there's also an element of balance of how pitch sensitive is it, meaning that when that moves around, how does the amount of grip front to rear change?
Yeah, it's super interesting. Yeah, because right now, with Suzuka out, I've been trying it, nonstop. And through those S's in the first sector, the car, the pitch just changes so much because you're just on and off.
Yeah.
And there's coasting.
Yeah, and so the things you can do that, again, take this with a grain of salt of that I'm a D3 silver driver, I was D4. Well, so I'm not the fastest guy. I'm sure somebody like Evan can tell you, a better response of how to actually do it from a driving perspective. But the thing you want to do from a technical perspective is do things that shift the weight around less. So be softer on the accelerator, don't hit the brakes as hard, right? Rather than downshifting from third to second, or from third to second, stay in third so that there's less engine braking, that'll pitch the car less. So you basically want to be just soft on the controls and soft and change, so that the car pitches less, and then the balance would be better. Now, you can also do the thing that I talked about with the bump stops, right, is lower the bump stops or increase the bump stop rate so that when you hit the bump stops, those are controlling the pitch rate of the car. The other thing that you could probably do and where I would actually start is move that aero center backwards, right, because you're going to have more fundamental stability going in all those corners. The car will be a little more understeery, but it's better controlling that rather than, losing time because of the fact that you're constantly counter steering.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Okay. Joel?
No questions. Thank you.
Okay. Hopefully I pronounced your name right. Apologies if I didn't. Ken?
Yeah, everything's really good.
Okay. Thanks for jumping in there, Ken, as well. Appreciate it. Koa? Sounds like nothing. Lorenzo? Nate?
I guess I would just ask, like, from kind of the standpoint of what you were mentioning earlier, from the D5, D6 guys' perspective, if you're trying to get familiar with the impacts that different changes make on an aerodynamic standpoint, and you're wholly unfamiliar with the entire processes, except for everything that you just explained, which I think was awesome, mind you. Is there anything that you would recommend that one start with making changes with? Like, all right, maybe go out, do several laps and adjust this parameter.
So here's what I would say, right? The biggest thing that you need to do is get on consistency, because if you're inconsistent and you make changes to the car, you don't know whether it's you that's causing the problem or the car that's causing the problem, right?
Sure.
So my actual recommendation is, everybody says start with the aggressive default. I think you should start. You're in D6, right?
Yeah,
Or
I was
D5,
in
yeah.
D4 last season.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just start with the safe setup is what I would tell you, because for you, an understeery car is good because it behaves predictably, right?
Gotcha.
And I would just say, okay, if the car is too safe, like I can't even turn it in, right? Then raise the rear just a couple clicks, right? And
Gotcha.
get the car to a point where you say, okay, I feel comfortable, like I can actually sort of drive this car, and it's doing what I want. Now I can focus on me being more consistent in the way that I approach corners. That's where I would get the car to. But if I was in your position, I would only do two things. I would start with the safe pre-setup, get the tires in the right pressure ranges.
Yep.
That is more important than anything, right? Because like we
Yeah,
talked
I got
about
that
with the
one
friction
pretty
equation.
good.
Yeah. Get the tires in the right pressure ranges, then just drive the car. And again, if it's too understeery, raise the rear a little bit, right? Because that's the least impact. Or bring the nose down slightly, because that's going to have a more impact if you need it, right?
Yep.
And get the car to a point where you're saying, okay, it's turning in the way that I want it to. Now I'm just going to focus on driving.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it was kind of surprising to me whenever you were like, yeah, aerodynamics. That's kind of like the big thing you should probably have some knowledge in. I'm like, oh shit, that's like the thing I have the least knowledge in. Like I got some mechanical track knowledge, I got some mechanical grip knowledge.
Yeah.
This and that. I've gotten pretty good with the tires, but man, the aerodynamics, I was lost. And tonight I am just slightly less lost. So I do, and which is a huge improvement for me. So I want to thank you, by the way, for
you're welcome.
Tonight's session.
Happy to do it. Yeah, and GT3 cars, aerodynamics matter much more than mechanical grip.
Gotcha.
Okay. Rigatoni?
Awesome to know.
No, there's a lot of information to take in, but I think I'm okay. I just want to thank you for doing it too, taking your time out of your day.
You're welcome. Happy to do it. Roberto? Sam? Selena? Okay. Sarver?
Nope, I'm good.
Waleed?
No, just gotta get on track now and get to consistent so I can start playing with Arrow.
For sure. Zach? Okay. Sounds like that's everybody's questions. Obviously, if you guys got questions, let me know. You feel free to DM me. I'm happy to try to answer what I can. That being said, again, keep in mind that I'm approaching this from an engineering perspective. From a drive. I just want you to. The message that I want you to take away is this is something I tell myself too, right? Is your D1 or D2, like your setup probably matters because what you're doing with the car is a lot more sophisticated than what you're doing if you're, set back half of D3, D4, D5, D6, right? Just get that aero right, get that pinch sensitivity right, and then focus on your driving, and then